you're wondering how you might go about setting up your Zoom F6 in order to record your piano. In this short video, I'd just like to take you through the main things that you might need to look at and some of the main choices available to you. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. Hi, this is Tommy with Tommy's Piano Corner, the place for returning pianists or indeed anybody who loves piano to share tips and ideas of how to get the best from this great hobby. If it is your first trip here, then please do think about subscribing. Simply hit the little icon in the bottom right hand corner of your screen now and it's all done for you. For those of you like me who've decided to take your recording to the next level with more sophisticated equipment, today I'd like to talk you through the main things we need to set up in the Zoom F6. To do this, you'll need an SD card, one or more microphones, I would say really 2 is your minimum, and power, so either AA batteries, a Sony L-type, a power bank or mains power. In this video, I'll cover off main things such as sample rate and bit depth and how we need to think about these when we're setting up the F6. All the Zoom F6 settings are available by an easy-to-use multi-level menu system operated by the 4 buttons on the front of the device. To enter the menu, we click the button with the 3 parallel lines. To scroll between the menu options, we use the up and down arrow buttons. To make a choice, we click the button with the tick. To return to the previous menu level, then we click the button with the 3 parallel lines. And once we're on the main menu, clicking this button again closes the menu altogether. So let's give the menu a go and format the SD card, which we insert into the slot on the side of the unit. Now, as you can imagine, the Zoom F6 has a staggering number of options that you can set when you're configuring it, and I don't think most of them matter so much for us as pianists, but there are some that I think we do need to understand properly so we can decide how we want to set it up. Now, bit depth is, if you remember, the reason I bought the F6 in the first place. It's because it records in 32-bit float. So let's just try to put this into context. If you think about a standard CD, this is generally in 16-bit, okay? Now that means that it can hold more than 65,000 different values as it records the information coming to it from the microphone. Another standard format is 24-bit. And this takes more than 16 million different values. So you can see that is a staggeringly big difference. So what do you think 32-bit float might actually hold? Because the word billion has a different meaning in different places, let me just say that 32-bit float can hold 4,000 million different values. So as you can see, it's got a huge range in which it can store the data. So then, to all intents and purposes, when we use 32-bit float, it means we can never really spoil a recording from having incorrectly set up our microphone. Now, the Zoom F6 even goes beyond giving us a choice of different bit depths, in that it lets us record in 2 bit depths simultaneously. So for example, you can record in 16-bit and 32-bit, you can record in 24-bit and 32-bit. The reason I point this out is that simply if you use a 32-bit file, then it's going to require a little bit of extra processing when you're doing your audio work on your computer later. And for that reason, you might think, well, it'd be simpler if I could just have a 24-bit file. And that's why you can, in fact, record the 2 simultaneously. You can use a 24-bit file, and then if anything is wrong with that because your microphone gain was incorrect, you can use the 32-bit as a backup insurance, if you like. What you choose to do really is up to you. I mean, for me, I've just gone with 32-bit float because it's not a massive amount of extra work to manipulate it afterwards in the computer. Now then, let's look at the main other thing we need to think about, which is the sample rate. Now, this is a gross oversimplification, but you could sort of think a little bit about sample rate in the way we think of frames per second in videos. As you know, basically, a video is a set of still images that are displayed one after another at something like 24 or more different images per second. And what our eyes see is a moving picture. And audio, as you might guess, is recorded in a similar way, in that there are lots of little snapshots of the sound that are taken, and these are called samples. And the sample rate is how many of those snapshots are taken in a second. Now, they're much, much higher than frames in a video. So as I said, videos say 24 frames a second, 30 frames a second. Sample rates start at 44.1 thousand times a second. Another common number is 48 kilohertz. So kilohertz is 1,000 times per second. Believe it or not, with the F6, you can actually go up to 192 kilohertz, which would be 192,000 samples per second. An old friend of mine many, many years ago told me that basically you can always do less with more, but you can rarely do more with less. Okay, so he was talking about central heating systems at the time, but what he was basically saying is, if you have something that's slightly more powerful than you actually need, it will be able to do less than its full capacity. Whereas if something's not powerful enough, it can't really do more than its full capacity allows it to do. And you can think the same way in terms of the audio. The higher the sample rate you use, the more detail you're going to collect. Now, this is where it can start to get a little complicated, because basically your computer will be set up to use a specific sample rate when it works. And if you notice carefully, when you load something into Garageband, it will automatically convert the sample rate if it doesn't agree with the one that the computer uses. Cubase, however, doesn't do this automatic conversion for us, and I assume it's because it expects that the people using it know what they're doing, and if they've imported a file at a certain sample rate, they've done it on purpose. So the problem it gives is that suddenly the files can stop working for no particular reason, and they start playing back really, really slowly, and it's very bad. So the option I eventually went for was to use 42 kilohertz as the recording, because that's what they use in audio for videos anyway in general, and then simply to change the standard setting on my computer so that it also used 48 kilohertz. Let's dive into the Zoom F6 then and look at how we can set these things up. The first time you switch on the F6, you'll be asked to set the date and time. This uses the standard menu buttons we discussed earlier. To set the year, we click on the tick when we have year highlighted. Using the up-down arrows, we can then move to the year we want and click the tick again. We then use up-down to highlight the month, click tick, and again to select it, and so on and so forth for day and then for the time. The Zoom F6 should remember these settings then, even if it's not powered up. Now, when I first bought mine, it kept asking me every time I turned it on to set the date and time. So I raised a ticket with Zoom, and basically what they told me to do was leave the Zoom F6 plugged in using USB into a mains power supply, switched on, and just leave it overnight. And then after that, it'll be fine. And in fact, it was. I've not had any problems with it since. As we select the menu using the 3 lines button, we see the different menu options we've got. Bit depth and sample rate are in the record function. If we scroll to record, we then click tick to select this. Our first option is to set the mode, and this is basically where we define the bit depth or depths that we want to use. We have linear 16, linear 24, float 32, dual 16 and 32, dual 24 and 32, and MP3. As I explained, I simply use 32-bit float. However, you might prefer to use one of the dual options. You simply scroll to the one you want and click tick to select it. Next, we have the sample rate, which I've set to 48 kHz. We set this in the same way, scroll and tick. I'd recommend that you initially stick with this to avoid undue complications as you get familiar with processing the audio afterwards. Next, we need to set the file format, and I've set this to mono stereo. I leave the metadata alone, to be honest, as the Zoom F6 automatically creates separate folders based on the current date every time we press record. So this then is easy enough for me to find the files that I want. Set the LR tractor on, and this means that this input will also go into the stereo file. I set pre-record to off. Pre-record basically means that if you press record a little bit late, it will automatically include a few seconds prior to you hitting record into your file. Of course, when we're recording ourselves playing piano, this is not really going to be an issue. Okay, before we go to the next main menu, which is the input, let's talk a little bit about microphones. As I've said, the Zoom F6 takes 6 different microphones, and each one of these is a standard SLR input. Now, there are different types of microphones, and they need to be treated in slightly different ways. I bought a matched pair of Rode NT5 microphones, and these are condenser microphones, which require something called phantom power. To explain this really simply, basically, the diaphragm within the microphone capsule captures very, very tiny differences in air pressure, and that's how it works. And in order for our equipment to read that properly, it needs to get a bit of a boost, if you like. So the microphone requires this phantom power, or a very low voltage, to be fed into it whilst it's being used, so that it can boost the signal, it becomes effectively audible for the equipment that we're using. Therefore, when we're configuring our Zoom F6, we have to tell it whether or not our microphone will need phantom power or not. So this then is a very important thing for you to check. Whatever microphones that you've bought, make sure if they need phantom power that you provide that by setting it up. And if they don't, you make sure that the setting is not activated in your Zoom F6. To tell the Zoom F6 about our microphones, we're going to use, as you might have guessed, the input menu. From our first input menu screen, we have an initial selection of PFL. This is where we set the type of input we wish to use for each individual microphone input. As we select it, we then have inputs 1 to 6 available, and these, as you might guess, are numbered in the same way as they are on the unit itself. We select the input we wish to configure using the tick again. The first thing we get to set is the source. From here, we'll choose between microphone, where our microphone does not require phantom power, or mic PH, where our microphone does require phantom power. There are also line and USB inputs that we don't need to concern ourselves with what we're doing at the moment. In terms of the other settings, we're able to set the high pass filter and limiter. A high pass filter is a means of helping to reduce background noise by filtering lower frequencies. If noise is a concern for you, then by all means do experiment with this. I don't use it. As for the limiter, with 32-bit floating point, it's not even available, because basically a limiter is there to electronically stop the audio from distorting, which, given we're using 32-bit float, is not a problem for us. The phase and delay can also be left alone, and I leave the pan to center. As for monitor, I'm sure you'll have seen many YouTube videos where the presenter sits in front of their microphone with the headphones on. What they are doing is monitoring their audio, so they're listening to their own voice through their headphones as they speak. As I never do this, given there's enough to think about when playing piano without having to listen to the audio coming from headphones, I simply leave monitor at its factory settings. You'll need to set up each input you intend to use. I currently use only 1 and 2, so that's all I've set up for now. Next, back on our input menu, we can set our phantom settings. This basically tells the F6 how much voltage to supply where there's an input set to microphone pH. The choice is 24 or 48 volts. My microphones use 48 volts phantom power. And note that this is not a per input setting, but it's used by any input that will supply phantom power to its microphone. For our purposes, we can just ignore the remaining settings. We don't need to worry about the output menu. However, let's briefly discuss timecode. Basically, what we're able to do with timecode is we can record an actual timecode against our audio and send that same code to whatever camera we're using so that the same timecode gets recorded against the video. And you can guess in a professional situation where they're using lots and lots of cameras and lots of microphones and lots of things need to be all put together again in the cutting room, that this is pretty much vital stuff to have. But for our purposes, given we'll have one or two cameras and it's simple enough to manually sync the audio and the video together, I've not added this extra complication to my recording. And to be honest, I'm not even sure if it would work with a smartphone. System, as you might imagine, is pretty much the same as the kind of thing you'll find in settings on your phone apps. So I won't go through all of these. I think they're pretty much self-explanatory. But on the off chance anything that you're not quite sure about, by all means leave me a question in the comments and I'll do my best to answer for you. So basically, that's pretty much all you need to do. And once you've done this initial setup, then your Zoom F6, unless you change microphones, for example, is now pretty much fire and forget. You simply plug the microphones you've got into the inputs that you've already configured. You turn the switch so that it activates the microphone, and basically I just set both to the same value, even though strictly speaking it's not necessary to do that, and off you go. As soon as we press record, both microphones will start recording in whichever way we've told them, in whichever file type we've told them, straight away for us. Keep a lookout for a video coming soon on Cubase and how we actually then take the files that are on the Zoom F6 and process the audio on our computer. If you're not already, then please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to click that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I do thank you very much for watching and look forward to seeing you very soon.